Welcome to the Living Room Disciple podcast. Today, I'm really excited to introduce Kristin Barnett. She's the Director of Operations over at Neighborly in Tallahassee, Florida. And one of her passions and goals at Neighborly, and where her background kind of falls, is helping that organization be equipped to meet the needs of refugees in the community. And this is a bit of a hot topic as it relates to refugees, to migrants, to undocumented immigrants. But I'm incredibly stoked to introduce you all to Kristin to help navigate the conversation around how do we love the foreigner in our community, and how are we formed when we do or do not. So thank you so much for joining the Living Room Disciple podcast, where discipleship finds a home. Kristin, thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me.
So this is the very first time, by the way, that we have completed a married couple cycle. So we had James, your husband, on a few weeks ago, and we're super stoked that you all are just like a power team over at Neighborly, and that you're coming on to help us navigate kind of a different topic and conversation piece.
Yeah, no, I'm really excited to hear about his. I didn't eavesdrop much, so
it's
come out.
It's pretty good. It's pretty good. But one of the reasons I actually asked for both of you to come on is, we had connected some time ago, and one of the things that became really prevalent, me and my wife, you and James, we were all on a call, and it was so obvious to me that the two of you are really passionate about the Lord, but also about kind of the poor among us, those in need. And specifically, I remember it was like late at night that like we had this like chance to do a video call, and you talk so passionately about the opportunity to serve those who are foreign to the area, so immigrants. And I'm going to use all the wrong terms, and so you're going to help educate me today. But and I remember leaving that conversation, and part of my feelings were like, there's a whole section of ministry in our nation that I am absolutely ignorant about, and I am doing nothing in. And so I'm selfishly bringing you on to kind of understand how me and my wife and my family and listeners can approach loving and serving those in our communities that are not local, whether local to our nation or who found their way here into America in some way,
right,
and are in need. Okay, are you tracking with me?
I am. Yes, yeah, I know. I remember that conversation, and yeah, I think you're not far off from the average. I would say maybe American. That's all I can guess. That's the main place I've lived, but in that, when a lot of immigrants. There's a whole, section of terminology we can use, but I specifically work with the refugees. But it's kind of easy to insulate ourselves because, at least in my city, Tallahassee, a lot of the refugees, when they come, they tend to stay near people of their same, ethnic background and language group, which makes sense for a sense of familiarity. And also, they don't immediately have access to transportation. And so they kind of stay in their like little pockets, especially depending on where they're resettled housing wise. I would say the average person in my city might not even realize there is like a ton of Afghans here or Syrians here, unless you kind of know where to look or you're living in those areas. And so that's kind of what's so exciting about learning about kind of those migration patterns, and also understanding, like taking a step back and understanding God's heart for the foreigner, and kind of what we can do. And I do think everyone is called to love and care for the foreigner in some way, but it might not be as intense for me because it's my job and I am just like so excited. And a little bit is in a self-serving way because it's so much fun. Like you get to travel the world just by stepping into someone's apartment. So
how did you even like end up in a position, not just at Neighborly, but like in your life, finding a passion for? And I know, I really do believe that all Christians are called, but obviously you've been equipped with a passion to go along with that calling. So I mean, tell me a little bit about the story. How did Kristin get to the point where like this is something that you care about and have become educated on?
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for asking that. I grew up right outside of Washington, D.C., in the Capital Beltway in Maryland. And so in that area, there just were a lot of people from all over the world kind of highly concentrated. And so I grew up with friends from many other countries. None of them were refugees. Maybe they were first, second, third generation. But so, one of my best friends was Sri Lankan, another was Indian, another was Gambian. And so I grew up kind of seeing from their families and being invited to their homes, like all these different foods and cultures that I, didn't have in my own home. And so I thought it was so cool. And one of my friends, Delaney, actually her parents joke that I used to speak their language, Sinhala. And kind of growing up middle school and high school. And I was never fluent, but I was just like surrounded by it so often. It was fun to kind of talk to them and that. So when I went, decided to go to college, I wanted to kind of originally work in politics in DC. And then after a while realized that some sort of international something was what I wanted to do. So then I got my master's in international affairs, and just taking classes and being exposed to all different types of like international law and legal protections and seeing all the different opportunities that you could do around the world was what really got me excited to do that as my career. And I will say, like, during that time in college and in post grad, my main force for pursuing this was more motivated by like humanitarian, I think, desires. I was a Christian growing up. I gave my life to Christ probably in like second grade, got baptized sixth grade. And I had a personal relationship with Jesus, and was just I'm really thankful for my childhood. And then I went to college, and I think I was just so focused on
changing the world,
grades and like climbing this corporate ladder, and so it kind of almost came from a viewpoint of like prestige and like what kind of eventually maybe I could become a diplomat, and so what do I need to do to get there? And it really wasn't until looking back, until I met James, my future husband, we were talking one night all about this, and it kind of was made obvious, like, oh yeah, like the Bible mentions like refugees a lot. Maybe not in those terms, but all throughout the Old Testament, we see God commanding his people to open up their doors to the foreigner. He says, you were once exiles in Egypt. And then Jesus reiterates it again in the New Testament. And so that's when kind of like the light bulb clicked of like, I think I have an even greater purpose if God put this in me and for so long, and now I'm recognizing it's also my worship to him. And I say all that, and it's really funny because then as soon as I graduated, 4.0, I had all this head knowledge. I couldn't get a job in the field domestically because I had no experience. I didn't actually know people, which is what, Neighborly, who I work for now, is all about, the relationship. So I could spout off all the current statistics, but I had actually like really never had a friendship with a refugee. And I did get a job with a Peace Corps, and I did, get some jobs overseas, but my husband and I, we were newly married and felt like God was not calling us to live overseas, at least not then. So that was a struggle for me to kind of what I felt like was closing that chapter and like, okay, now I'm in, the US and I'm not even in my field. So I actually ended up working at different law firms for about 7 years in Atlanta, Jacksonville. And, it was not fulfilling at all.
And so eventually, though, Neighborly starts investing in this community in Tallahassee?
No, it wasn't until we moved back to Tallahassee. I had my second son And then when he was about 10 months, I felt the Lord and James prodding, calling me to quit. So like just being done with kind of the corporate world, it was helpful. I do want to say like there is so much value in Christians being right in all aspects of businesses and jobs, but I just felt him saying to quit and for me to start that program. So that's when, I think 2021 is when I joined on staff as Neighborly to do, all sorts of things, operations. But my main hope was to start some sort of like um, resettlement program and see like how could we impact refugees here in Tallahassee. So this is now our third year.
In a moment, I want to like dive into like what you all are doing at Neighborly, but specifically like what every Christian could be doing. But I guess there's like a question that something you had said kind of like teed up a little bit, and this might be a rabbit hole, so forgive me.
Yeah.
You were talking about how when you and James were initially talking, he was kind of discussing how we see the foreigner and the refugee all throughout the commands of the Old Testament, and God commanding the nation of Israel to take care of these people. And oftentimes, I think one of the things that makes this conversation sometimes divisive in the church today is because it's so wrapped up in legislation and policy. And also, a lot of times the church becomes divided really around this point. And so somebody like, I'll just be transparent like myself, I would say, if this is the heart of God in the Old Testament, that this continues on, and I feel like this is his heart today, that he wants us to step in and love these people. But others would say that those were laws and commands set for that nation and that culture at that time. I guess, how have you reconciled that? And like, why do you feel like Christians are called to serve, immigrants among us, refugees among us? Yeah. Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah. Right. Because there are a lot of Old Testament laws that are pre-covenantal. And so then, Christ comes and frees us from the burden of those. Of course, I'd personally never call it a burden to care for the immigrants, but I can see that kind of argument being taken.
Look, on the outside, it feels like a burden, Kristin. Like it does. Like it feels daunting and scary and uncomfortable and unsafe, and you know what I mean?
Yeah, I had pulled up some scripture. I mean, I think the easiest answer is Jesus himself does reiterate care for the stranger, welcome the poor. In the New Testament, in the Beatitudes, Paul also repeats it. So I don't think he changes his character in this regard. And of course, they didn't have nation states like we do today. Borders were more porous. But let's see. So some examples. We will post on social media, not photos of the refugees to respect their privacy, but just kind of things that we've done and to share stories. And I got pretty livid. There was a comment just from someone who I could tell that they claim to be a Christian, and they just said, "Do they have papers? Are they legal here?"
Yeah.
And my first response is, "Why does that matter to you?" And the second response is, yes, they are. They actually have been background checked more times than you by at least 5 different agencies, FBI, Homeland Security. They've been thoroughly vetted. They have legal right to work. And even from a policy standpoint, and I'm not a professional in this. I think I used to really want to be able to have an apologetics for this topic and be like up to date. And I have let go of that because it doesn't. I don't need to do that. But from an economic standpoint, in the United States, refugees contribute so much back into our economy. I think like there have been longitudinal studies, long-term studies that say the amount of money that's first put into caring for refugees, through social support services is increased tenfold over the span of 20 years because these refugees create businesses, they pay taxes, they actually boost our economy. And it's kind of obvious why, because they faced persecution or war, and they're so excited to be here that they have, to me, I feel like I've seen a lot more, motivation from refugees in many aspects of their lives because they know what it's like to have nothing, or to have lost something. One of our friends from Afghanistan, they kind of were bouncing all over it when Kabul fall. They barely escaped. The husband was, he was beaten up by the Taliban, like literally as he was trying to make it on the Air Force One, and still has back problems. But he came here with his family to Tallahassee. We actually picked them up from the airport their first night, and had become such close friends. But they were like wealthy. They were the equivalent of millionaires in Afghanistan. Like, they showed me pictures of their home. It was a compound. They had foreign cars, and then they come here, and they are so grateful, but they're given HUD housing, which is referred to as Section 8 housing, where there's cockroaches biting her girls, and they have food stamps. And she was like, this is not enough. This is not like how I feed my kids. And, it's like not every refugee should be viewed as like taken on with this pity of like, wow, you must be so grateful to be here. Like, you should be happy with these handouts, or you should be happy with this box of donated goods, because they all come from, such different backgrounds, whether it's a camp, or, they were in their own home.
I think there was something you said too that I think is almost the crux, and it's just cool that maybe I'm just politically burnt out because, I think so many of us have had so many conversations over the last like decade, especially, and like it's election year. But I remember, developing ideas that I really feel like were convictions from the Lord. And I do believe helping those in our community up, no matter where they come from, is just a part of God's heart. And then I felt the need to like begin to defend that with statistics.
I see. Yeah. Yep.
And I think to your point, there's almost like it just doesn't matter. And I think one of the things that I would challenge listeners with and myself with is it's reading the scriptures as a whole, entering into prayer consistently, and learning the heart of God, and then saying like, if Jesus has come to fulfill the law, and as he discusses the fulfillment of the law, we're getting to know God's heart more and more, right? Like his heart isn't just that my hands will not sin, but that my heart and my mind will not be of sin either, right? So on and so forth.
Right.
And then just say like, so what is the heart of God here? And if loving and serving the refugees in us destroyed our earthly economy, it would still be the right thing to do.
Yes.
Because it's in alignment with God's heart. But I do think, because I want to just give this a little bit of an air, because I think it is oftentimes the thing that holds people up. The commenter on the social media post, do they have papers? What they're getting at, what the heart is, and I think what somebody who's calm and rational would try to say is, but Kristin, like, is it right for me to enter in? Because in my community and in many communities, especially along the border, there's going to be immigrants in their community who are not in the nation legally. And so the question becomes, if I serve them, and by service, we might mean by developing relationships with them, helping, with chores, food, bills, taking their kids to school, whatever it is. If I do that, I'm supporting illegal behavior and not submitting to my government, right? So let's just imagine like a really well-intentioned, good, like how would they navigate that potential quagmire? And I know that you're working with refugees who are here legally, but let's just imagine the opposite end of that spectrum. What's our biblical responsibility from your perspective?
Yeah. I think from my perspective, I, like you said, would not be so worried about the ramifications on local governments, on policy, unless that's your specific job. One of my friends, Maddie, she's a caseworker and also really passionate about refugees up on the East Coast. And she wants to do public policy. She actually just had a meeting with like that local school board, like trying to fight for rights. And so, if someone is gifted with that's great. And that, we need all sorts of people in this. But for someone who is, just a citizen and they're a believer, and they notice asylum seekers or immigrants who are not here legally, I would encourage them to not focus on any sort of political ramifications. And I say that though with a grain of salt, because Florida, I don't know if you remember, last year, maybe a year and a half ago, passed, I don't know if it's still in effect, some sort of bill that made it illegal to transport someone who was undocumented. And so we kind of got a few calls from reporters just being like, well, like, what's your response? Because then that does actually affect, and there are ramifications for just anyone who helps, whether knowingly or unknowingly. But see, even there, it's I would still do it. Like, I might go to jail, but really, like, are you, I shouldn't say this about any situation, but like, am I really going to go to jail for that? And if I do, I think, that would probably blow up in the bill's face. I think that's a form of activism. But then knowing, I have a great support system, so I can have that viewpoint. This kind of goes on a tangent, but someone who maybe is a single parent and they take that stand knowing there's going to be consequences, like they can't afford to kind of put themselves in that situation. So I do want to give everyone the opportunity to like assess the situation, but I don't think there are lines that God draws on status, whether it's migrant, asylum seeker, displaced person. I think he has the same heart for all of them.
Yeah, I really think that's a good point. Let's just imagine, somebody is here, they're undocumented, they shouldn't be here, they've come, classic story, whatever it is. And then the real question is, so is there an extent of human behavior that exempts them from the love of the church? Is really the question, like, is there a point in which an image bearer of the Creator can act in a way, can do a thing, that makes it so the church should not love and serve them? And Scripture would make that case that there isn't. And then if there is, it's probably not a federal misdemeanor. So I just feel like that should. Okay, but enough on that, because I'm grateful that you even facilitate that conversation. I do think it's difficult. I'm sure many people disagree, but it is one of those things where, let's just say, no matter what the situation is, somebody's convicted like myself. I want to love, I want to serve those in my community. But Kristin, I have no clue how. And I think there's a lot of believers in this category who, if like an asylum seeker knocked on their door, they would figure something out. But that's not going to happen to me tonight, right? That's nobody's. So what? Give us a starting point.
How do you get started? Even myself, the way I got started was I knew of an apartment complex in our city that housed a lot of refugee families. Just a lot of ones from different countries were placed there. And so I literally just knocked on their door.
Wow.
So I had never met them before. I knew people who had met some families, so there was kind of a connection. And I also know that all of these families, like I said previously, have been vetted. So kind of like safety wise, I should have gone with someone. That's step one. Go in pairs. Even the disciples always traveled in pairs for many reasons. But I literally just knocked on people's doors and they just welcomed me in, especially the women. the first, I think, few families I met were from Afghanistan. They spoke a language called Dari or Pashto, and those are really hard to find on translator apps, like on your phone. So really, it was just like smiling. They'd make tea. We would sit, and then sometimes they'd like even hand me papers. This is interesting. I'm, clearly an American, and I think there's a lot of things that they need help with. So even a few weeks ago, as I was leaving a family's home, they handed me some papers that they couldn't read, and it was like a really important like legal document that they had to answer very quickly. So I was like, oh, okay, let's figure this out. I'm not saying I would recommend to listeners just go knock on doors.
Yeah.
I would say the actual practical first step, if you like just have no idea, is well, first to contact if you're part of a local church, like see if they already have a ministry. And if they don't, there are resettlement agencies in most cities, at least most major cities. And what I mean by that is the federal government contracts with 9 different like social service organizations, and they are the ones who get the funding to like do everything related to the resettlement. Their papers, their flight here, housing, food stamps, all of that. Some common ones are like Lutheran Social Services, Catholic Charities. The one in our city is called International Rescue Committee. And so those organizations are always wanting volunteers. We are not one of those organizations. And of course, I, prefer people to, serve with us. But that's just because we do things a little bit more relationally. But I think if you're just getting started, like they will give you really good training on like how to have cultural competency, kind of like history, what things to avoid. A lot of things in conversations when people come from trauma is like a basic thing is like not asking up front, like what happened, like, they'll tell most people.
That would be me, by the way.
Yeah. Well, people will probably volunteer it, but a lot of times I'll just ask, like, where are you from? Like, what was your home like? Questions around kind of their culture. And then you can easily like look yourself, like if they are from the Congo, you kind of can look up the history of the Civil War. And then most of them have left to other countries like Zambia, Zimbabwe. And you can kind of like paint a picture of yourself, and it's just kind of helpful to know why maybe they do things the way they do, or why maybe they're having certain bigger needs in certain areas. But yeah.
What does it like look like though? Neighborly, develops relationships with these individuals. Like what would a refugee need from a guy like me? You know what I mean? Like what, like,
yeah.
How do you really serve? Like, what do they need?
Right. So one thing that is a little bit freeing for me in my job, and also as I encourage people to work with refugees, is the fact that refugees have legal protection that is so unlike other categories of migrants. So migrant is the broad term, and then you have asylum seekers, and those are most of the people at borders where like they're coming and they don't have any paperwork, but they probably have a credible fear of persecution, and so they want to present their case to a judge, but they haven't yet. So they're seeking asylum. So they still have really no rights other than the U.S. is supposed to like hear their case. Then you have internally displaced people.
And it's in that process, like the government's like capped the number of like individuals that they'll allow in each year, right? Okay.
Yeah.
And this is where most of the politics ends up happening in the conversation.
It is. Yeah. And then just with terminology, illegal and alien and things like that, which I prefer not to use, but I wouldn't have a preference. But I know individuals do themselves because they're like, how am I illegal? I'm a person. But anyways, with
I've
refugees,
never thought of it that way.
Yeah, it can be an offensive term for some folks. So, I just try to avoid it. but undocumented immigrant is like, I think, the preferred term.
Okay.
And the reason I separate to give a distinction between the two is because when you are documented and you do have refugee status, the U.S. itself gives you the same constitutional rights as a U.S. citizen. So you and this person, like, both have access to all the same opportunities, at least on paper. So things that they need from you are a lot less, in my experience. You know, it's not like they have work visas, right? Or green cards. So like maybe they need help finding a job, but actually when they first come here, that's their caseworker's job, is to help find them employment. Maybe they want like better employment, but like, you know, they have access to a job, they have benefits, insurance, depending on their income level, they have, you know, food stamps. So the things that they need from us is things that are a lot easier to give to, like, for any lay person, if you will. So like really it's just like they'll ask you questions like, you know, we've been here, I've been in America, like I'm 34, so I kind of know like how to file my taxes. I kind of know, you know, how to schedule a doctor's
I still don't,
appointment.
and I'm 32
Yeah.
for the record. Like,
well, and that's a funny thing. A lot of times we're working with insurance and I'm like, this is really tricky for me to figure out. Like, how would you have done this? So like questions will get asked is like, can you, like, my son needs an eye exam. Like, how do I do that? And so all like you really could just sit down with them and be like, okay, where's your insurance? They show you their card. All right, let's call this dentist, or what did I say? Eye. Let's call this, you know, optometrist together. They have an appointment. Okay, like, do you need a ride there? Like, do you know how to use the bus pass? You know, just helping them navigate society, less like you're not actually economically fully like supporting them. Now, I'm not against that, but yeah.
So really, like, oftentimes what you're saying is like partnering in relationship with someone who's new to our culture really has less to do with like doing things for them or just handing them money, and way more about just helping them navigate the things that are complex, even for us. Yes. I still Google like most things. You know what I mean? Like I'm still struggling with taxes but because I was raised in this culture, I just have more foundational building blocks to figure it out.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. Like
that's significantly less intimidating than I was expecting.
Yeah. It's really not. I mean, a lot of it, it's just like simple questions. And if you don't know the answer, like you Google it together. Or sometimes it's just like helping translate, especially for some of those families we work with, like they could speak English, but maybe when they see a document from the school, like, and the teacher is giving an announcement, like, what does this mean? And then you just summarize it. And I was saying like, oh, there's like an art show your child's in. Oh, okay. I'm excited to go, you know, and that's what I really mean by being friends with, because a lot of the things that they need are things that you and I would need if we didn't have community. So like playgrounds, like we have kids, like I know some good playgrounds around here. They might not know where they are or like which ones to go to. So it's just as simple as
Kristin, why does it feel like the longer I'm in the church, the more it feels like the answer is less program and more relationship? Like it feels like 9 times out of 10, the right answer is bring them into your community and love them.
Yeah.
And that's like it.
Mm-hmm. I actually had a good conversation about that today with a potential volunteer. This couple had just moved and they had experience overseas and just wanted to learn about who we were. And like, I was kind of, as I was talking to them, I was like, you know, we used to do all these things, kind of English classes, medical advocacy, and I had like these volunteer teams, and we still have that. But I told her, you know, really the best way to do this is just what I feel is a more holistic approach is just like organic. So like, tell me, like, what are you passionate about? Okay, you've worked with Muslims before. Like, how about I match you with like a Syrian family, and we just like see how it goes, and then like kind of like become friends with them, pair you off. And of course, you've got questions, ask me, but like not in telling you like sign here, like do this
Mm.
weekly. Um, it it's detrimental only to nonprofits in terms of like, right, it's harder for me to write for grants. Um, it's
Mm.
hard to it is a harder to show our programs on paper.
Yeah. What's your return on investment? Are you
Yeah,
really, if I give you money, are you really effective? No, but honestly, right? Like what it is it's the confrontation between efficiency and what's probably really effective.
intimacy. Yeah.
And intimacy, ooh, I like that. Yeah, and so we approach things from an efficient standpoint, bring them all in to a class, give them information, and hope that information, there's enough of it sticks for
Mm-hmm.
assimilation. And really that doesn't work. What really works is what takes a long time, is incredibly inefficient, and it's the developing relationships and intimacy. But that
Yeah.
means that you have to mobilize like the whole church to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it just starts with one family. I mean, you're south, that's more southern Florida, right?
Hmm.
So I assume there's a lot more Spanish speakers, and we're getting a
Hmm.
lot of refugees from Colombia, Venezuela. So like
Hmm.
even that, like having the same language, it's so much easier to hit it off, and like they'll just be so excited. And I think that's just one less barrier. It can be. I do try to give not credit, but give understanding to people who maybe have never put themselves in a like cross country
Hmm.
setting or haven't traveled much, because it can be if you it can feel awkward if you're not used to that, because maybe when you go into a home, usually we're going to their homes,
Hmm.
and they don't speak the language, like you're sitting there and there's like a bunch of people, and like you're like, what do we talk about? I can't talk. And so I think
Mm.
for a lot of us, we like want to fill the space and want to feel like meaningful. But I always encourage our volunteers, like they don't care. They're just like happy that you're there. It's not awkward for them. That's the main thing. So just like be happy to sit, like be happy to just like eat whatever food they give you. It's for them, like quality time is a really big love language, I've noticed. And we have actually learned to figure out how how to budget our time, right? Because if I go over to someone's house bringing something, and I just want to pop in, just like be like, hey, I was in the area. It can be considered rude, right, to leave before 2 hours is up.
Oh
Um,
no.
and so I used to just kind of
I'm
like
way too
sit.
American for that, is how I feel.
Yes. And then I tell people, they're like, I don't have time for that. And I think since then I've felt more comfortable in, especially if I know them, being like in the front. I'm just here, for a little bit. Like I think it's okay, to
Yeah.
mix those cultures and
You know what I
and
thought
just
about
do
just
what you
now,
have.
though? Do you remember that verse? And I'm sure you think of it a lot. Like when Jesus is like, look, when you do this for so and so, you do this for me, right?
Yeah.
And it's just really challenging for me to process the fact that like loving an individuals that I'm uncomfortable around is somehow like loving and serving my Lord,
Mm,
who I'm not uncomfortable around at all.
yeah.
And if you had the opportunity to sit in the physical presence of the physical Christ, 2 hours would not be enough. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like I wouldn't want to. I would never leave.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
That's
And it's like,
beautiful.
what if I considered the individuals in my community that the Lord's called me to love and serve, whether or not I speak their language, whether or not whether or not I'm comfortable with the food or the smell or the environment. Like if I viewed these people as images of my Lord and Savior, who I'm so comfortable around and so intimate with,
Mm,
would I feel hurried in the way that I seem to always feel?
yeah. That's really good. Yeah. And I think, yeah, I think a lot of this can and should be done like with whole families, not just leaving it up to like one or the other parent to be like, okay, like let's see what I can do. And I think it's so instrumental for children to see different backgrounds, and maybe they get that at school or wherever. But it almost makes it easier for us. Like I bring my kids a lot, to what I call work. And then it's just so sweet to see them develop friendships with kids that they can't speak their language, because like hide and seek is universal. And I think kids are also a big like.
Is the floor is lava? Is that universal?
I haven't seen that one. No,
Really?
I'm sure
My kids were playing it the other day, and I know I didn't teach them that.
That's so funny.
And I was like, "Where did you learn that?"
Yeah,
that's
great. But yeah, I don't know if that answers your question. There's just different ways to get involved, whether it's through organizations. A lot of times there might not even be the resettlement organizations. It's like, I don't know, like a Hispanic society of an area, or like cultural centers, mosques. Like they all have connections. And I think I don't want to say starting small is fine, but like just start,
And it sounds like there's going to be a different entrance point depending on the community you're in.
Yes. Yeah.
Can I ask you one last question?
Yeah.
So you've probably even recently worked with a lot of volunteers and seen people for the first time start interacting with and loving and serving refugee communities.
Mm-hmm.
When people do that, when believers, followers of Jesus begin that process, how do you see them shape? Like, how do they change over like, a year of that type of ministry?
Yeah. Great question. So one of our friends, they met a large Congolese family last summer. As soon as this family arrived, and it was their first time meeting a refugee family, and I think they were just so shocked, that wow, there's people here and came from a camp, and there's so many of them, and they just wanted to do everything for them, right? Because you kind of see the difference in lifestyle and kind of ability. And so this young couple was just so eager to like, take them to get their nails done, go to the pool. Like they started their own personal fundraiser, like for the family. And so they were just so fired up. And that was really exciting and beautiful. But after a few months, then they started to get burned out, because there was like 10 of them. There's just 2 of this couple. And so I definitely saw them like see the fun in it and the excitement and like learning so much. And it's like this really cool exchange of, they're getting to try their food and vice versa. And like just their eyes opening to all sorts of stuff.
Let me ask you this.
Yeah.
How are, that couple, so that they go on this journey, right? Where they go from excitement to burnout. How are they being shaped spiritually? Like, what are you seeing in people who serve this community, in their spirit, in their attitude, in their maturity?
Yeah. I think there is a reorientation of priorities, of realizing the world is so much bigger than just like our own world. And so I think that gives people the ability to step back and like, for example, not worry so much about like getting caught up in this American dream, that we have, when you realize like the great needs of other people. And so I'm saying that's spiritual because like Christ calls us to a lifestyle of simplicity. And it's not just like caring for others in your excess, it's caring for others as part of your first fruits. And so that, of course, can look like tithing. It can look like financial generosity towards these refugees, generosity in your time. And I think something that is an important value for our own family is not filling our own personal and our children's lives with so many extracurriculars that we don't have the time to be intentional with other people, whether that's people in our community or the people we serve, which are sometimes in the same group. And I think that's really hard, right? Because like my kids are in t-ball, and it's really cute, and it's just like the rec league, but they have like a practice a week and sometimes 2 games a week, and like they're only 4 and 6.
Yeah.
So
I've done
and
this
I'm not saying, parents shouldn't invest in their kids, extracurriculars, but figuring out how to live a life, and we're just navigating this, but like how to live a life that is less rushed and busy and peaceful, so that you can follow the commands of Christ and being intentional towards your neighbor. So, yeah.
I definitely think one of the themes that came out that I wasn't expecting is the need to be intentional and to budget the time that we have. And I think that comes back to that idea that like oftentimes ministry like Christ is less efficient and it's more intimate, and it's the deep sacrificing of not just our financials but also like our presence and our time. And thank you for doing that work and for training other people up. And I doubt it'll ever be really efficient, but I pray that it continues to be really effective. Thank you so much for tuning in to me and Kristin's conversation. I acknowledge that when we're discussing, undocumented immigrants, documented immigration, asylum seeking, it's so packed with discussions of policy and politics that it can be easy for people to not bear the image of Christ in our minds, but to instead bear the image of legislation or policymakers or political parties. And I just pray that our conversation helps move our mindset away from thinking about people as political talking points and more about them being image bearers who, when we love and serve, despite the circumstances, we are doing to them in a way that Christ can say, like, when you fed them, you fed me. When you spend time with them, you spend time with me. And so huge shout out to Kristin and Neighborly for doing that work in Tallahassee, Florida. And I'm prayerful that you all can get connected with something like that in your community. I know that will be a goal for me and my family. So thank you so much for tuning in to Living Room Disciple podcast. Thank you to Micah Pop for doing all of our amazing production work, to Eric Church for getting this podcast out into the world, and for Daniel Ramirez's composition of our music for today's episode. And thanks to you, as always, for hanging out to the end on the Living Room Disciple podcast, where discipleship finds a home.